And I'm going to kick us off by giving you a little bit of an introduction into neurodiversity in general, what it is, um, the different kind of types of neurodiversity that exist, and also look a little bit at inclusion. What is inclusion in the context of education? Why is it important? And then after that, I'm going to look at autism in particular, focus on that, and look at what autistic people are like, basically. Hopefully bust some myths which you may have heard about autistic people, and look at how we can include autistic students in the classroom, in any lesson, really, any, whether it's language learning or any subject that they're learning, it doesn't matter. Okay, so let's start. As you can see, the title of my talk is Increasing Accessibility for Neurodiverse Students in the Classroom. So that's going to be the focus. How can we increase or improve neurodiverse students' access to learning, essentially? And before we start properly, I should just mention that when I'm talking about neurodiversity, I am talking about it from the perspective of someone who has lived experience of it, because I have autism and ADHD. So I'm an ADHD, you can call it. Some people call it. I also have a son who's 8 years old who also has autism and ADHD. So when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about it from a perspective of my own experience. And from the experience of being a parent to a child who's neurodiverse. And of course, my experience as a teacher comes in all on top of that too. So just so you know, I think it's important to point that out at the start. Okay, so let's get going. What is neurodiversity? So it's probably a word that you've heard often, but you may not be sure exactly what it is. In some ways, it's kind of become fashionable lately. You may have heard people talking about it on social media or in the news or just from colleagues. So, of course, the neuro comes from neurological, connected to the brain, and diversity, of course, means a range of differences. So it recognizes the range of differences in brain function. Okay, so the idea is not to say, you are bad because your brain is functioning differently. It's just to say there are lots of different ways in which the brain works, and trying to give these different ways a degree of parity with each other. So the ways in which the brains of neurodiverse people function differently is in terms of sensory processing. So how they experience sensory input, sights, sounds, smells, etc. How it affects their motor abilities, so their ability to use their hands, their bodies. How it affects their cognition, so thinking, learning, remembering, and their focus, so their concentration, and their social comfort. So by social comfort, I mean how comfortable people feel in different situations. So as you can see, neurodiversity affects a lot of different aspects of your life. So these are going to be things that you're going to be dealing with every day. Every day, you're going to have sensory input. Every day, you're going to be thinking. Every day, you're probably going to be in social situations. Every day, you're going to be using your hands, right? So this is why neurodiversity really affects people's lives in a significant way. Now, a little bit of science. It'll only be short, I promise. So within this range of differences that is neurodiversity, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists have identified certain tendencies, so kind of groups of characteristics. So there are certain tendencies in behavior and cognition. And then the identification of these tendencies has led to medical diagnoses for different types of neurodiversity. Autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and dyslexia. So you're going to have an expert on each of these three types of neurodiversity talking to you today. So it's worth pointing out that autism spectrum disorder is the medical diagnosis. When we're talking about it generally, we prefer to use the term autism, just autism. And of course, words like disorder obviously have a negative meaning, very negative. So many people prefer to replace disorder with condition, which is more neutral. Okay, so you have to be a little bit careful with the terminology you use here, right? So as not to offend anyone. Terminology is important. But everyone will have different perspectives on what terminology they want to use for themselves. So it is okay to say an autistic person, I am autistic. But some people say, I don't like that, because if you're saying I'm an autistic person, I'm autistic, you are saying that that person is solely or overwhelmingly characterized by their autism. And some people say, no, I don't see myself in that way. I'm not that characterized by my autism. I would prefer to be described as a person with autism. So the autism is like my handbag, which I carry with me. So it's with me, but it's not part of me. It's just, I'm a person with autism. Some people prefer that definition. Some people prefer, again, even more distance between the person and the condition. And those people prefer to say a person who lives with autism. And of course, the lives with is now a kind of preferred terminology for talking about any kind of difference. It shows that compassion and also that idea of the condition is not you, it's something that you have to deal with. Okay, that you do deal with. You know, it also has a positive meaning of, you know, you do deal with it. Personally, I prefer the terminology an autistic person. I don't mind being characterized in that way. I don't think that autism characterizes who I am to a dominant degree, even if I use that terminology. So that would be my preference. Okay. So having talked a little bit about what neurodiversity is, I was wondering how many of you have taught neurodiverse students up to now. So if you could bring up my poll, please, Evelina, that would be great. Thank you. So as you can see here, the poll question is, how many of the students you've taught were neurodiverse? And I have given some options because we have to have options. The majority of them, around half of them, 10 to 20% of them, hardly any of them, so less than 10%, or none of them. So I wonder, what does your experience of students with neurodiversity mean? So I'll give you about 20 seconds to input your answer to the question there. And then we'll see what results we have.
I'm here, Claire, if you want me to share any results with you.
Yes, please do.
So we've got about 5% say the majority of them, around 8% say around half, 40% of the result of the people that answered says 10 to 20%. 40% hardly any of them, and 7% say none of them.
Okay, so most people are going for around 20 to 5%.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's really interesting. Probably that your percentage may depend on how long you've been teaching, but okay, great. We'll go back to this at the end of the talk and see if there are any changes to your perspective. Okay. Thank you. Or let's disappear that. Great. Just like magic. Okay, great. So we know what neurodiversity is, and we've talked about autism, but why? I mean, you know, Vicky and Burlo and I today are going to be talking a lot about what can we do to include neurodiverse students, strategies and tips and so on. But the question is, why is inclusion important? Okay, and unfortunately, whisper it, but not all teachers seem to believe that inclusion is important. I'm sure that doesn't apply to any of you here because you've come to this session. But I think it's really important to just reiterate that it is important because you're teaching the whole class, not just some of the students, or at least you should be. That's what you're there to do, as I see it. Probably agree, right? And the class needs to function as a community for the whole class to be successful in their learning, right? The class is a community, and in communities, we should also help those who are struggling in one way or another, or facing challenges in one way or another, to overcome those challenges. That's what communities do. That's what they should do. And when everyone is included, everybody wins. Okay. Okay. So having said all of that, some people would say, okay, Claire, but what do I do if there's a child in my class who's autistic and who's disruptive? Because he is constantly humming while he's working. And the other children find it hard to concentrate because he's always like humming. Okay. At that stage, it's important to understand that the child may not be able to stop the humming. The child may not be able to immediately switch off the humming. Okay, so we have to, you know, of course, the whole class, the whole community, we have to, as teachers, consider the whole class and do what's best for the whole class. But we also have to have that compassion for neurodiverse students who, you know, maybe, yeah, like in this example, inadvertently disrupting the class. There has to be some compassion there, not just tolerance or not just, oh, well, if I have to do that, but there has to be some compassion there and some understanding that the child is unintentionally disrupting in nearly all cases. Okay, so this is why we need to be aware of these characteristics of autism and other types of neurodiversity so that we can show that compassion. That's what it all comes down to, really, I think, right? Being awareness leading to compassion, leading to success and winning for the whole class. Okay. So I want to start by looking at some stereotypes of autistic people. How many of these stereotypes have you heard? The first one is they take medication. Maybe a stereotype a bit more associated with people with ADHD than people with autism. But I remember when I first mentioned to my son's teachers this year that he has autism, the first thing they asked me was, what medication does he take? And I said, well, no, he doesn't take any medication. So I don't want to criticize, obviously, I don't want to criticize the taking of medication. But I think it's important to realize that this is a bit of a stereotype, a little bit misguided understanding of what it's like to be autistic. Some autistic people may take medication for depression because there's a high incidence of depression amongst autistic people, including autistic children. but generally being autistic is not something that you need to take medication for. Okay, autistic people are brilliant at maths. I can personally attest to the fact that this is not true as an autistic person who's rubbish at maths, and who I struggle to help my son with his third grade maths homework at times. So yeah, the stereotype of the brilliant savant mathematician with autism is definitely not true for everyone. I wish it was. To some extent, I wish I'd been better at maths at school. There's also the stereotype that autistic people have no social skills. So maybe the stereotype of Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory on TV, he's seen as, you know, having no social skills. He does have friends, otherwise the series wouldn't work. But it's definitely, obviously, it's not true that autistic people have no friends. They certainly do. And they also have social skills. It's just that their social skills are different to neurotypical people's social skills. Their social skills are, let me tell you in great detail about this book I've been reading, or let me tell you in great detail about this thing I'm building from Lego, or whatever it may be. They like to go in deep in social situations. And for other people, that is a sign of social incompetence. I've also heard the stereotype or the assumption that everyone who is autistic lives in some kind of care facility. And it's important to say that, yeah, this is the case for some autistic people. Some autistic people are unable to cope with day-to-day life on their own because they're unable to cope with paying bills, talking to people they don't know, and they do need that care. But this is definitely not the case for everyone. Okay, most autistic people live happy and independent lives. And this feeds on to the last one. They can't speak, okay, or they have problems with speaking. What is more of a common issue, especially amongst autistic children, is what is called selective mutism, which you may have heard about, meaning they are physically able to speak, but they choose not to, usually because they feel extremely uncomfortable in the situation that they're in. So unfortunately, we have a lot of children going to school who have autism, who are just not speaking for weeks or months at a time because they feel overwhelmed by the situation that they're in socially. Their level of social comfort is so poor or so low, however you want to put it. Okay, so yeah, let's move on to stereotypes more in terms of how autistic people learn. So they can be seen as disruptive, causing problems, making noise. Maybe true, they may disrupt, but they're not necessarily disruptive. They may go to the other extreme and be very shy and quiet and really not interact with anyone or not even speak, as we just mentioned. They can't sit still. I can testify to the fact that this is not true. I spend a lot of time sitting still as an online teacher and writer, so I can definitely manage that. Most autistic people can also manage it. They can't write legibly, and there is a higher than average occurrence of a condition called dysgraphia amongst autistic people. And dysgraphia is a condition which makes it difficult for you to write legibly. So some autistic people, if they also have dysgraphia, will, of course, struggle to write legibly. But it's not an autistic trait in itself. They have a photographic memory. That makes me think. I wish. Now in my 40s, I sometimes struggle to remember where I put my keys. I wish I had a photographic memory. That fits into this, like, the autistic savant stereotype. They don't want to work in groups. It's not really that they don't want to work in groups. It's just in some social situations in groups, they feel uncomfortable. Like if they're with people they don't feel comfortable with, they don't trust, or if they don't have a clear task to be getting on with, or maybe they're in a group with people whose ability level is lower than theirs, for example. They could feel frustrated because they're like, oh, why don't these people understand? It's so easy. That could lead to frustration, but it's not necessarily the case that they don't want to work in groups. In fact, neurodiverse people have some excellent qualities. It's really important to spotlight that. And it's not just me saying that, the people at GCHQ, as you can see here, also think that. I don't know if you've heard of GCHQ. You may well have done if you're from the UK. But if you're not from the UK, GCHQ is the central spy agency in the UK. So if James Bond was a real person, he would work at GCHQ. And the current director of GCHQ, Anna Keyes-Butler, has said, neurodiversity and dyslexic thinking are highly valued at GCHQ. In fact, they are mission critical. We need the right mix of minds to keep the country safe, and our neurodivergent staff can think creatively, spot patterns, and solve problems that other employees might miss. Okay, so that's really great that she's making such a positive statement about neurodiversity, isn't it? So you notice she's also used the term neurodivergence. That's a term that some people use as an alternative to neurodiverse, or neurodivergence, the noun. And she separated neurodiversity and dyslexic thinking, which is interesting because usually we think of dyslexia as being part of neurodiversity, but okay, she's seeing them as different things. Yeah, and you may well have heard of Alan Turing, the great Alan Turing, the famous code breaker. He's widely believed to be autistic, the English code breaker, Alan Turing. He's widely believed to have been autistic, and he, famously was the lead figure in cracking the Enigma code for the Allies during World War II. Okay, so in the next part, I want to look at how inclusive strategies help everyone. So inclusive strategies do not only help neurodiverse people when that's what they're targeted at, but they can help everyone. And here are some examples that show that to be true. An example of an inclusive strategy which will help neurodiverse people is giving clear instructions and breaking instructions down step by step. Okay, this helps neurodiverse people to understand the instructions better. But it's also something that most of us, if you have done a CELTA course or any kind of teacher training course, I'm sure you will have been told to make your instructions clear. It's a basic principle of teaching a foreign language. So yeah, this helps neurodiverse people and also everyone. Neurodiverse people also prefer written instructions to verbal instructions. But yeah, there's no reason why you can't, written instructions too. Explaining changes that are going to happen. For example, from next week, our lessons will be taking place in room X. We won't be in room Y, and that's because of building work in room Y. And we'll be in room X for 6 weeks, and then we'll be back to room Y. This is, of course, helpful for everyone. When change is happening, it's helpful for everyone to know why and what's happening. But it's especially important for autistic people who find change very unsettling and need that explanation. Autistic people also have a need for being made aware of the real world relevance of the tasks they're asked to do. This increases their motivation. But of course, this is also helpful for every student to know, how could you use this language? Why are we learning this? Neurodiverse learners may take a lot of time to complete tasks because they have this kind of perfectionist trait, which makes them want to just keep going until everything is perfect. But they also often finish tasks very quickly, so they need extra tasks. But, giving fast finishers extra tasks is also a principle of language teaching, right? Neurodiverse students, especially autistic students, I should say, I'm focusing on autistic students, They like to have the chance to ask as many questions as they wish. Even if it's, say, a grammar topic, present simple versus present continuous, they want to be able to ask questions, why this, how does that work, etc. But, these are all things that teachers, you're probably doing anyway. So when I talk about autism with teachers, I've noticed a lot of them say to me, "Oh, Claire, this is all very well that you're telling me what to do to help autistic students, but how do I know if my students are autistic? I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. So how should I know?" Completely fair enough. It's difficult to help students through their autism experience if you don't know that they're autistic. How can you? So yeah, you may not know that your students are autistic because they may not know it themselves, especially if they're children. A lot of autistic people are diagnosed with autism in their pre-teen age or teenager age, or as adults. Some people are not diagnosed until they're 40. So the student themselves may not know that they're autistic. If they do know, they or their parents may not feel comfortable with disclosing it, or they may still be in the process of getting a diagnosis for autism, which can take several years. Sometimes parents don't want to disclose it because they feel like it's going to be a sort of black mark against their child, which is obviously due to a negative perception of autism. And perhaps the child has got a diagnosis of autism, perhaps the parent has informed the school of this, but somehow this information has been lost and hasn't got to you for whatever reason. Okay, so these are all the reasons why you may not know that a child is autistic. And of course, it's not your job to diagnose your students with autism, and you shouldn't try. But there are certain characteristics or tendencies that you can kind of look out for. And these include a student completing a task poorly, even though they have the ability to do it well. And you know they have the ability to do it well from talking to them. But then when they had a written task, they've performed poorly. And you're like, that seems strange. And if that happens consistently, they were not just having a bad day, but something is going wrong between them knowing stuff and applying stuff. Often autistic students can concentrate better when they work alone, so that may also be a sign. Autistic students often think that their teacher hates them for no reason, without any reason. I know my son is always super nervous around kind of parents' evening times. He's like, "Oh no, she's gonna say that I'm not good." And it's always like, "Oh yeah, Henry, he's great. He's doing great." But there's this nervousness of like, does the teacher like me? And the student shouts out answers in class. This is also an issue that my son has been dealing with for about 2 years. We've only just about got to the point where he doesn't do this anymore. It's been a journey. Or the student is wearing less or lighter clothing than other students. So by that, I mean, it's winter in January, it's cold, and the child is wearing a short sleeve t-shirt. And the reaction of most neurotypical people to that is, "Oh, why are you wearing a t-shirt? Aren't you cold? Are you all right?" And, it's just because of sensory issues of feeling uncomfortable when you're hot and kind of fear of being too hot. So yeah, obviously not something you should shame students for. So if you notice several of these tendencies, it's a good idea to maybe have a chat with the parents first if you can, and just mention what you've noticed and leave it with them, because they're ultimately going to be the ones who are going to have to go and find a diagnosis for the child. The child can't do it themselves. And I think it's important that you do this because being an undiagnosed autistic person can be very difficult, not knowing why you are doing the things that you're doing. And that brings me to a page from this book, Unmasked, by Ellie Middleton, who you can find on LinkedIn. She's a neurodiverse influencer, you could say, and talks a lot about neurodiversity. She's a young woman who a lot of young people can relate to. And she has written here, to grow up as an undiagnosed autistic person or ADHDer is to spend a lifetime being gaslit, ostracized, and misunderstood. It is only natural that our mental health would suffer as a result of that. So people's mental health is going to suffer if they're not diagnosed. So doing what you can to help them to become diagnosed, if you notice these tendencies, is only going to do them good. Right. Okay. So then we need to move on to, what is it like to be an autistic learner, specifically when it comes to learning? So what you can see here, I don't know if anyone recognizes this, what is going on here, or what language this is, but it is Chinese characters. Words for, yeah, I know the first one is sky. As from my son, he is learning Chinese because he's growing up trilingual and he's really loves languages. So we thought it'd be great for him to learn another one. So he's learning Chinese. And he loves doing drawing the characters on this grid. And this is really fun and really engaging for him. He can do this all day, this like repetition of drawing the characters. And this is kind of typical of a lot of autistic learners. Repetition often feels comforting and good and not boring. Repetition is good. It's kind of the opposite of what you think for a lot of students. Repetition is good. But they like repetition in terms of, I'm going to write the same letter or character 100 times, but they don't really like repetition in terms of, let's review all the tenses again, because they're like, oh, I know all the tenses, like, don't need to review that. So there can be a fine line between what they like and don't like when it comes to repetition. They switch between phases of high focus and distraction. This is just because all of the sensory processing which is going on and all of the dealing with social situations, it's like their computer, inner computer, is getting a bit hot and then stops working. They can feel disconnected from their teacher. Like I mentioned, this kind of perception that their teacher hates them, even though there's no evidence for that. They can easily feel overwhelmed or frustrated because they're under-challenged. So it's not that autistic students find learning difficult. They often find learning easy, but they get very unhappy and they may even perform poorly when they feel like they're under-challenged. They need enough challenge. The classroom can be a scary place for autistic learners, and especially the playground. There are sensory issues, especially if they have to wear a uniform. That can be really unpleasant, especially with like a shirt and tie. And just the having to negotiate all of the social interactions can just be so difficult. You know, how do I make people like me? I don't know. Should I say something funny, or what is funny? Just the classroom and school generally can be a scary place for autistic students. That's why, unfortunately, we find a lot of autistic young people staying at school, staying at home, because they don't want to go to school. It's difficult. So finally, we're going to look at some changes that you can make, some practical changes that you can make in your classroom to help autistic students specifically. So I've divided this into changes you can make before the lesson, when you're planning your lesson, and changes you can make during the lesson. Because I think, especially with autistic students, how you plan the lesson is really important. Think about how you can give those clear and step-by-step instructions that I mentioned. Prepare extension activities, because autistic students are likely to be amongst the fast finishers, and they'll get frustrated if they don't have additional work. But on the other hand, planning time for autistic students needing longer to complete a task. Have some understanding for the fact that it's really important for them to at least try to complete something perfectly and really put a lot of work into it. Think about where you're going to seat the autistic students, or how you're going to group or pair them based on what you know about who they feel most comfortable with. And planning time for question and answer sessions so that they can ask all of those questions that they want to ask. Okay. So then moving on to changes you can make during the lesson, and the topic of stimming, which we haven't really discussed yet. Have you heard of what stimming is before? If you haven't, it's a kind of thing which autistic and ADHD people do to kind of, how can we describe it? To sort of deal with anxiety, deal with discomfort in social situations. And it's often a repetitive movement. Or it could be a sort of clicking maybe with your mouth, or just some kind of repetitive movement. Again, as I said earlier, autistic people feel comfort in repetition with learning, and that's also what we see with stimming, the repetition of a specific action. And the natural tendency amongst teachers, if they see a student, say, tapping on the desk, is to say, stop it, what are you doing, stop it. But, we should really, show that compassion I mentioned, and understand that the child is doing that because it's helping them to cope, and they would otherwise struggle to cope. And unless that tendency is really disruptive or really harmful to them or other people, we should let them do it. Don't automatically tell them to stop it. Try and talk to them about it. Why are you doing that? That's irritating other people a bit. Maybe try not to do that if you can. But understand the fact that they may not necessarily have control. And it's not that they're wanting to disrupt everyone. Don't criticize or openly express surprise at reactions to sensory overload. So don't be like, oh, why are you wearing that t-shirt? Monitor students so you can think about where to seat them and how to group them. Have regular one-to-one check-ins so they know that you don't hate them. And consider adapting homework tasks so that they fit better with this profile of enough challenge, comfort in repetition, and maybe even getting them to bring in their special interests. We know autistic people love their special interests. Okay, so that's all that I have to say, except to say thank you for listening.